Welcome to Families in the Millennium. I'm Cindy. I am so excited to share with you today from Elder Gong's talk, speaking on holiness, some very important information that I think can save our world, but it has to do with something really cool that not only does he exemplify in his talk, but it's something that we can simply do to bless those that are all around us. So let's get started. This is the talk titled Holiness to the Lord in Everyday Life from the October 2024 General Conference. And it is given to us by Elder Garret W. Gong of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And here's the summary, essentially. Holiness to the Lord makes daily living sacred. It draws us closer and happier to the Lord and each other. Here is, what I found so exciting. And I'm just me. I'm not anybody special. I just love studying the word of the Lord. I love studying the scriptures, and I love studying and sharing what I find. So what did you discover in this? It's every bit as important as what I might be sharing with you. But what I discover and find, I share freely. So there was something that really stood out to me that became the vein all the way through of something so life-saving and powerful that I just had to share it with you. And it is this phrase. Let's go find it. It's this: we each have a story. We each have a story. So I want to start with a story that someone had sent to me, and I'm keeping it anonymous. So I'm going to give her the name of Mary because I want to respect so much the sacred nature of her story. But this is her story. And when she had sent it to me, I said, oh, may I share this with all our friends out on the channel because I found it so inspiring. She is a hero to me in so many different ways. And so I'm going to share this with you. So Mary writes, in 2019, my two youngest sons and I knew we had to get out of a certain state and away from an abusive situation. She said, we didn't know exactly what we needed to do, and they were watching a movie, and she said, doing the next right thing became our motto. So with that in mind, I'll interject here, in spite of the trauma of what's going on, they're going to focus on doing the right thing. And I think you're going to see how blessed they are because of it. But she said, little by little, the Lord led us in the right direction. We had an absolute miracle from the Lord. In July of 2020, my son, I'm going to call him Dave, who moved to Utah just days before the shutdown, felt strongly we then needed to move to a certain city. 2 days later, my husband was offered a job transferring with his company from out of state to that region. A week later, my husband, then needing to work, drove away, leaving my son and me to pack up the house. We were told by a realtor it would take a miracle to buy a house in that new city. 2 weeks later, her husband was able to find and buy the house. 10 people had bid on it, and the seller picked us because my husband is a journeyman carpenter and will do the work necessary to fix up this old home. This was all during the summer of 2020 and the shutdown. Then she shares, once we arrived here in October and I was such a mess, a friend of mine back in our home state notified me that her 2-year-old daughter, who was in remission from acute myeloid leukemia, was no longer in remission. She just said, the cancer's back, and the little girl was given a 5% chance of survival. When Elder Gong is talking about we each have a story, and the more and more I looked at his talk, I realized we each have a story of holiness. You have a story of holiness. Every one of us have stories of holiness. And I believe his talk is helping us to discover those, because the more we tell stories of holiness, the better able we are to see the holiness within us. So let me show you what I mean. There's a researcher by the name of Robin Fivish, and she writes for Psychology Today in an article called Why Sharing Family Stories is Vital. And the summary is intergenerational stories are important for positive youth development. And what's really interesting is that as we look at this, it doesn't matter if you have children or not. It doesn't matter if you have grandchildren or not. Your stories of holiness, stories of another word, another summary for holiness could be trial plus triumph. Trial plus triumph. Those are stories of holiness. And we're going to dive deeper into this, and we're going to look at Elder Gong's words on this. But your stories of trial and triumph are crucial for the next generation and the generation after that. And it has been said, you may have heard this, but 3 generations from now, if your stories are not recorded, it will be as if you had not lived. We need your stories of trial plus triumph. We need your stories of holiness. And we're going to look at that with Elder Gong, but look at this research. Intergenerational stories are important for positive youth development. 3 key points. Young people who know and tell more family stories show a stronger sense of identity and well-being. Intergenerational stories predict positive youth outcomes more than personal stories or stories about friends. And I have to tell you, the reason why I say it, it's not just like you can only tell these to posterity and make an impact. That's not true. When I was a young seminary student and I felt so lost because there were things that felt very rocky in my own life and in my own growing up sphere, I came to seminary one day and I knew he loved me and I knew he loved God. I knew those 2 things. I didn't know hardly anything else in my life, but my seminary teacher was my rock. And I knew he loved me and I knew he loved God. So he's standing up there sobbing on this Monday morning, holding a picture of his family with his different kids, talking about the trauma that had happened over the weekend because his wife had lost her pregnancy at home. They weren't able to get to the hospital in time. So she lost this baby that they had been so excited about, and all of this trauma had happened at home. And yet there he stands, sobbing, tears. I mean, this rock of a man, but he has tears streaming down his face. And in the same breath of talking about that trauma and tragedy, he's talking about how much he felt God's love, how good God was, and how God comes to comfort us with consolation in the midst of trials, through one way or another. That one story, and that is an intergenerational story because he was the generation before me, changed the rest of my life. So when we look at this research by Dr. Fivish, and this key point, intergenerational stories predict positive youth outcomes more than personal stories or stories about friends. Those stories make all the difference. So I invite you to be thinking about, first of all, your holy stories, those stories that are sacred, that are appropriate to be shared, not the ones that are not appropriate to be shared. But those stories that are holy usually come because of difficulty that then, because of a choice you made, became valiant, significant, and therefore holy. Be thinking about those as we look at a little bit more of this research and then go back to Elder Gong's beautiful talk on holiness and bringing holiness to the Lord. And so I invite you to be contemplating, how is it and why is it when we tell holy stories, or in other words, those stories of triumph in God to the next generation, how and why is it that that can bring holiness to the Lord? So we're going to come back to that. But another key point, young people who make explicit connections to, or in other words, very clear connections to self and intergenerational stories show the highest benefits. So she shares this research that a simple online search of why stories are important yields over 2 billion hits. The research is so deep on this. And then she says, in the 2 decades since Marshall Duke and I published the Do You Know scale that assesses individuals' knowledge of their family history, dozens of research studies have confirmed that individuals, especially adolescents and young adults, who know more stories about their parents and grandparents and tell these stories in more coherent and elaborated detail, show all kinds of positive outcomes. Just one more thing, and then there's something else I want to show you in Elder Gong's talk. These positive outcomes include higher self-esteem, lower anxiety, a higher sense of meaning and purpose in life. She goes, but what is it about knowing these kinds of intergenerational narratives that yield such positive effects? Digging deeper into the research helps provide an answer. Our first question was whether intergenerational narratives were as predictive of positive youth outcomes as telling one's own personal story. And she says, surprisingly, it turns out that intergenerational stories are more predictive of adolescent and young adult well-being than their own personal stories, in essence, of strength. So going back to Elder Gong's talk, when he says we each have a story, he highlights so many stories of holiness. So I'm going to share just a few with you. But again, I invite you to think about what stories of holiness do you have? In other words, triumph. Well, we could say it this way, triumph that came after the trial. Those are sacred moments, and the next generation needs to hear those, whether it's telling it to a young primary class in beautifully appropriate ways, or to, if you teach seminary, or if you have young people on your block, may not even be part of our same congregation. What stories can you be telling, or even to, if you have children and grandchildren, to your grandchildren, these tiny little stories? Elder Gong manifests them in such a holy way, but in such a simple way. Let's look at a couple. He uses this phrase over and over and over again in his talk. Everyday life. Everyday life. In everyday life, we can bring holiness to the Lord. In everyday life. It's in the title. Holiness to the Lord in everyday life. How do we do this? It's by the words we're using. The words we're using. And we're going to get back to a second point from Elder Gong in just a moment. But he's manifesting how we can bring holiness to the Lord in everyday life. And it's through the stories we tell one another and to ourselves. So for example, look at this and just be thinking about how this can become an intergenerational story, whether it's told to individuals in a class that she's teaching, maybe in primary, or maybe to her own posterity. It matters not. It's just we need these holy stories of holiness being told in our society today. So look at how simple this is. This woman that he's speaking of says, quote, in high school, I was in a dark place. I felt like God wasn't there for me. One night, a text from a friend said, hey, have you read Alma 36 ever? As I started reading, she said, I was overcome with peace and love. I felt like I was being given this big hug. When I read Alma 36:12, I knew Heavenly Father saw me and knew exactly how I was feeling. Do you see how simple that is? That's a moment of trial preceding triumph in such a simple way. But just by telling that story, she has brought holiness, a sense of God's power in our lives. And then as we turn around and share these holy and significant moments of triumph with others, we are, as Elder Gong is saying, bringing holiness to the Lord in everyday life. Here's another example. You'll notice in both of these, okay, so I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but these simple little stories often start with what the difficulty was, just like in one sentence. So right here, as she's saying, in high school, I was in a dark place. I felt like God wasn't there for me. In this story, she's saying, before we got married, as she's continuing, I was honest with my fiance. I didn't have a great testimony of tithing. So in other words, we're just starting with authenticity with this difficult moment, and it can be super tiny, a tiny little difficult moment. And so then she elaborates, why did God need us to give money when others had so much to give? So it's establishing that question, right? And then she says, my fiance helped explain it's not about money, but following a commandment asked of us. He challenged me to start paying tithing. And then she says, I really saw my testimony grow. Sometimes money gets tight, but we saw so many blessings and somehow paychecks were enough. And then she's also, here's another simple little story of holiness, that we can bring holiness to others simply by sharing these simple stories. And Elder Gong has this all the way through manifested. But then he also has a second point that I mentioned that we'll get to. But here's just one more. And I invite you to look through. He has so many stories in this talk. And it's fascinating. You start thinking about the intergenerational impact of what he is exemplifying by telling these stories of holiness. And then now it's been transmitted to the next generation and the next. And I hope you can just feel the sacred nature that when we share these beautiful stories, how we are bringing holiness to the Lord by bringing holiness of these sacred moments to the lives of other people. So what stories do you have? I'd love for you to share brief moments that where you've had these same kinds of experiences here by sharing comments. It would bless us all. But here's her next little story that we read. In my nursing class, I was the only member of the church and the only one married. Many times I left class frustrated or crying because I felt classmates singled me out and made negative comments about my beliefs, my wearing my garments, or my being married so young. So again, this simple little story just saying what the problem was. Yet, she continues, here's the turnaround, what she discovered and felt. This past semester, I learned how to better voice my beliefs and be a good gospel example. My knowledge and testimony grew because I was tested in my ability to stand alone and be strong in what I believe, end quote. Look at that outcome, because she's also explaining what it is that she learned. Now, going back to that research, one thing that the researcher says, quote, so what is it about these intergenerational narratives that make them so powerful? For one, these kinds of stories provide models for ways of being in the world. Isn't that amazing? Then she says, quote, to explore this in more detail, we started looking at whether young people actually made connections to themselves when they told stories about their parents, connections like, and I am just like my mother in wanting to help people, or my father's experiences really helped me understand how to stand up for myself, end quote. I might add, or I'm going to be like my seminary teacher and not quit on God because I now know he's there for me too. These stories are so powerful. The researcher goes on asking about these intergenerational stories. And so she says, is there something special about intergenerational stories? When simply asked when simply asked whose stories are important and who they most identify with, young people rank intergenerational stories much higher than stories about close friends, end quote. The next point that really stood out to me from Elder Gong's talk was his use of the phrase every day, in everyday life, in everyday life, in everyday life. How simple it is to bring holiness to the Lord in everyday life. And so often it comes through these kinds of holiness stories, tales of difficulty plus triumph. But if you wanted to do something fun, you could later pull up his talk, and I will have the links to all of these things in the description box below. Just click on the little 3 dots and more underneath the video, and that will open up for you to find. But do a search for every day, and you will find all of these examples where he's saying in everyday life, ours is a gospel of joy and holiness in everyday life. Your stories of holiness to the Lord. Remember that phrase that had jumped out? We each have a story, and he's saying your stories of holiness to the Lord in everyday life inspire us. So as you are, I won't show you all of the everyday life, but it's powerful how he brings that out over and over and over again. So I invite you to be thinking, he gives 7 C's. He says, speaking of you, and to those who are listening to his address, you live 7 C's. You're doing this. And I would invite you to watch the stories that you might be telling yourself that maybe, you might be saying, I'm not doing that. I'm not very good. Here's an apostle of the Lord speaking to people in general conference saying, we each have a story as Sister Gong and I meet you, church members and friends in many places and circumstances. Your stories of holiness to the Lord in everyday life inspire us. This is an apostle of the Lord saying how he is inspired by you and so many that he has met. And in what ways? And he's saying you're living 7 C's, and look at these. And so be thinking, you could even after this video get just a notebook And on one page, right at the top, communion with God, the next page, community, the next page, compassion, the next page, commitment, the next page, covenant, the next page, centered in Jesus Christ. And you could start just putting little bullet points of different stories where you have gained a witness, a testimony, or have been blessed with an experience to manifest this somehow with others. And I dare say it probably comes after something that's difficult. And then you could sit down and just voice dictate these stories. And I'm going to show you a place that you could be putting them in just a moment. But I just want to commend you, because this is what an apostle of the Lord has said, is that we each have a story, and that means you have stories of these kinds of triumph. And what is beautiful about this, let me show you even more. This holiness that Elder Gong, and oh, please just read and then cross-reference this talk, or look up the footnotes, and then share what came to you, because you will have a specialized, customized experience with this talk that's different than mine. And I would love for you to share, because my words are just certain kinds of thoughts. But again, like I said, what I have, I just share. He mentions researchers that study what they call religious structural stability. Guess what that is? That's just seeking to live a life of holiness, and then sharing these stories of holiness with each other, and then all of those other things that go to contribute to a religious structural stability. But guess what? Just like the intergenerational stories of triumph, this religious structural stability, or seeking the pathway of holiness, leads to clarity, leads to purpose, it leads to inspiration, it combats isolation, it combats feelings of loneliness. When we, as he says, say no to the profane, say no to snarky cleverness, say yes to the sacred and reverent, yes to becoming our freest, happiest, most authentic, best selves. And if sometimes we're not feeling like we're free or our happiness, give the process time, because it works. It absolutely works. So going back one last time for one more really potent piece of research, she says, quote, young people were asked to narrate stories about themselves, their mothers, their fathers, their closest friends, and she examined the extent to which narrators made connections between the experience of the person they were narrating about. Like for me, it was my seminary teacher. But in this case, for example, my mom loved to dance, and then their own self. I got my rhythm gene from her. That's how I feel about my seminary teacher. He transmitted that faith in God to me on that particular day. And she says, this researcher, when telling stories about friends, narrators connected these stories to who their friends were as people, but very few connections were made between their friend and their own sense of self. In contrast, when telling intergenerational stories, they made connections to their own sense of self. More importantly, it was only these intergenerational connections that predicted the narrator's exploration of their own identity, an important part of adolescence, coming of age. Your stories at church, whether you're sharing a story in when you are speaking in sacrament meeting, or serving in whatever area that you might be in, or in the community, or in your own families with your brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, everyone needs these intergenerational sharings of stories. The researcher says it is these family stories that provide a sense of place in the world, a belonging and identity that goes beyond personal experience to encompass a larger sense of who one is and should be in the world. End quote. Lucifer is doing everything to tear this down. Elder Gong's talk is teaching us how to build it up. And one of the things that he mentions is the stories that we tell. And then he talks and shares a variety of stories of holiness where people through difficulty found triumph, and thus the situation was made sacred. And then by sharing it has strengthened us all. So this researcher closes, quote, family stories are important. Telling, listening, sharing of stories from one generation to the next is vital. So now one more additional point from Elder Gong that is so crucial. He uses the word treasury. And oh my goodness, I just wouldn't have time enough to dive in and dive in and dive into so many different things that he has in this talk on building paths of holiness and bringing holiness to the Lord. But this word treasury to me was exciting because treasury is all brought together and caught up in this. It's contemplating what holiness to the Lord in everyday life looks like, and then holiness in everyday life, what it feels like. And again, he gives story after story, transmitting the power of these kinds of moments, what they look like and what they feel like, that the next generation and the next generation needs. It's these everyday life experiences, such as this one. A sister does her best each day after her husband was unfaithful to her and the children. I deeply admire her and others like her. One day, that's that every day, we can have holy moments while folding the laundry, her hand on a stack of garments, she sighed to herself and asks, what's the point? And then Elder Gong continues, she felt a tender voice assure her, your covenants are with me. And he goes on and shares story after story of one day, every day, one day, every day. And for me, if I could sum up Elder Gong's talk in one phrase, it would be this, quoted by Elder Gong, citing another individual, but it is this phrase, quote, this is a place of super healing. When we seek holiness, we enter into a place of super healing. When we seek to bring holiness to the Lord, it makes everyday living sacred. It draws us closer and happier to the Lord, he says, and each other, and prepares us to live with God our Father, Jesus Christ, and our loved ones. Here's his promise. As did my friend, you may wonder if your Heavenly Father loves you. The answer is resounding. Absolute. Yes. We can, as he says, feel his love as we make holiness to the Lord ours each day, happy and forever. May we do so. End quote. So I have to stop the share for just a moment. Your stories are so crucial. I want to share with you a really cool place to log them. You may be doing this already, but if you haven't started, it's a really fun hobby. And it would be cool to just like log one little tiny story every night. Maybe that would be a cool, fun outlet for you at the end of every day to be thinking of, how did I see God's hand today? How did I see God's hand today? And then recording it. And let me show you this. You may be already using this resource, but let me show it to you. This is familysearch.org, and you probably have used this, but I don't know how much. So it's great for doing your tree, etc. I don't know how much you have created family memories in here. So I remember the first time that I found Family Search years ago, and it was the very first night I had gotten onto it. And my husband came, it was like 3 a.m. He's like, are you going to come to bed yet? Because I was like, this is so cool. So not only can you create your own family tree, but you can record family stories, your own personal stories, using that simple little structure of whatever brought about a holy or sacred moment for you that you feel is appropriate to put on here, then do. So this is so worth being able to log in and to use, and the resources are free. Right now it's advertising Black Friday savings. I never monetize this channel. So I'm like not connected to that, and I don't monetize anything. What I learn, what I just share for free. So I never monetize this YouTube channel. But I just wanted to share this with you because for years I have used this, and the memory feature, once you have logged in, is so simple and easy to do. So you can even upload a photograph and then tell the story of that. And can you imagine these inspiring holiness to the Lord stories that you could be doing, even if it were just once a week on Sundays? After 12 months of doing this, you would have 52 stories of holiness to the Lord experiences. So what did you learn from Elder Gong's talk? Please, 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 please share in the comments below, because my thoughts are just one, but what I have, I share. I share. I love you. And I pray that you can feel the Lord's arms wrapped around you. If you are right now in the middle of the trial part, before getting to the triumph part, know that the triumph comes. It always will. That's what my seminary teacher testified of. That's what I learned. And his one story, even though we weren't related, is the story that changed my life for forever. Just imagine how your stories can change the lives of others forever, because you created a holy space by telling a story that helped make your life holy and closer to God. Thank you. And please reach out to somebody who might be feeling sad today. And I have to just tell you, thank you for your comments. They help me understand who you are and the valor of your life and your magnificent soul. And when you're able to leave comments, I love it, because then I'm able to pray for you by name. I pray for everyone, like I've said in the past, that comes to this channel. But when you're able to leave a comment and share a story or something, or words of encouragement, or you're just saying hi, whatever it is, I pray for you by name, because then I see your name. So I want to thank you, my friend. And until the next episode, I love you. Bye.